Hey, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about organizational issues that I hear a lot of people talk about. And I'll talk a little bit about some approaches that I've seen work. And obviously I'll be talking a bit throughout about tooling and how some of these organizational issues impact tool choice and at the end of the day, monitoring and also application performance. So I'm an industry analyst with 451 Research, so I specifically follow monitoring. So I spend my days talking to monitoring vendors, logging vendors, obviously like the Sumos of the world, and as well as talking to people like you all about how you use these tools, what the differences are between them, what your needs are, and stuff like that. So I'm going to start out just talking sort of big picture about why we are where we are in terms of questions around organizational models, and I'll show you some research. And then I'll get a little bit more into sort of the nitty-gritty. Can I have the clock? Thanks a million, appreciate it. So we did a survey, one of my colleagues did a survey recently looking at DevOps and asked about the benefits. This is something you guys all know, but just wanted to show you that sort of our research also indicates that speed and moving quickly is one of the big reasons that people move to DevOps. I think that's probably obvious to all of you. I think we asked a couple of questions here that I thought were pretty interesting. So we asked people what skills were essential for their DevOps implementations, and IT ops came up basically first and second. So here, unfortunately, when we did the slides, we kind of cut things off. For the responses, that second one we said domain experience, in parentheses, IT ops, and some other skills. So, there's some people here who maybe were thinking about ops as the first and second most important skills essential to a DevOps implementation. But here's where it gets interesting. Then we asked what skills were lacking, and it's possible that people were thinking IT ops for the top two responses, right? So 37% said IT ops skills, 39% said domain experience, which could include IT ops. So I think that's kind of interesting, right? I mean, ops is in the word DevOps, and yet people are lacking skills. And I think this ultimately leads to some problems that I begin to see that people struggle with in terms of application performance once they move to DevOps. I thought this was really telling as well. So we also asked people, what are the most important tools that are included in your DevOps implementation? CI/CD tools was the number one answer. That's, that doesn't surprise me a lot, probably doesn't surprise you all. You're probably going to need some kind of tool to help you keep the development pipeline and process moving. The second top response was monitoring tools, but only 35% of people cited monitoring tools. So again, the question is, what kind of tools are included in your DevOps implementation? So if you're not using monitoring tools, how are you doing the ops piece? So I think this to me, I thought was really telling. Also, maybe indicates some shortcomings from an ops perspective when people shift to DevOps. And so all of this is going on against the backdrop of quality and high-performing apps being possibly more important than ever. So this was a consumer survey we did where we asked people, what's the likelihood of switching brands or services based on poor performance, so slow or buggy software. 79% said they were either likely or somewhat likely to switch. This is obviously their intent. It doesn't say whether or not people actually did that, but I think this indicates what you all know, that quality software is really important when software is such an important piece probably of your business, right? So that experience has to be really good. And so against that backdrop, what I've seen is sort of an interesting progression or sort of development of the way that people approach ops. And some of you may find some of this familiar. So I'm going to sort of talk through these four phases that I've seen. This is a very broad look at this because, frankly, when I talk to people, almost nobody is organized the same way. So everyone I talk to has a sort of a different and unique approach to the way that they are doing development and ops. So you've got your traditional setup, which you guys are all familiar with, where you have a development team that writes code. You have a totally separate ops team. They do monitoring, they respond when performance problems happen, they fix those problems. They might move something up the flagpole to an expert to fix a particularly difficult problem. But these functions are separate, and there tends to be a whole bunch of siloed monitoring tools in use that looked after just one piece of an application. So the application layer, the infrastructure, you might even have different tools looking at servers, looking at storage, certainly different tools and different experts looking at the network. And then I began to see, as you all did too, organizations beginning to embrace DevOps for all the reasons that we've talked about. But what happened was then you began to have these DevOps teams in addition to development teams that maybe were working on legacy apps and legacy workloads, and you still had an ops team. And especially in enterprises, or even in organizations that have a large app that might be broken up into many microservices, you end up having lots and lots of DevOps teams. You might have dozens or 100 or more organized around services or microservices. And this is where I've seen the problem sort of start to happen from an ops perspective. And that's for a number of reasons. And one is there's not really a clear delineation of who's supposed to do what from an ops perspective. So you've got that old IT ops team. They're still doing their thing. And then you've got your DevOps team that's responsible for the code, from an ops perspective, for the code that they develop, but some of their services are running on, maybe services or workloads that the traditional ops team is responsible for. You also have this problem in a complicated microservices environment where no one is responsible for looking at the whole thing, right? So you've got the DevOps teams that are responsible for particular services or a group of services, but no one's looking at how they combined are representing the user experience. So things start to fall through the cracks is what I'm getting at, and often application performance drops. The other problem that happens here is the number of tools tends to go way up. So I very often see DevOps teams given the autonomy to do what they want, right? I mean, the point is they're supposed to move fast, so you're often given the opportunity to choose whatever tool set makes sense for you, and that includes monitoring. And so if you've got dozens of DevOps teams, you might have dozens of instances of New Relic or other monitoring tools. Everyone's choosing what they want. You've got, I actually did a survey with Sumo where we found, I'm forgetting off the top of my head, but the number of people who said they had 30 plus monitoring tools was high. It was significant. So when you've got all of these monitoring tools collecting data, keeping them in silos, it's not easy to get a good look at the end user experience. It's not easy to troubleshoot. And I begin to see application performance goes down in this phase. And so what I've started to see more recently is an approach that I'm thinking of as sort of the modern approach to operations. And a lot of times what happens here is the sort of that old traditional IT ops team takes on a new role and new responsibilities. They might be called the observability team. Sometimes what they end up doing is being the responsible team for choosing monitoring tools, for running those monitoring tools, for being the resident expert of those tools. So they're not doing ops in the same sense that they were in the traditional phase, but they're running the tools that the DevOps team uses, and they serve as a resident expert. So if you're on a DevOps team and you don't feel like you're getting the most out of your tool, you're having trouble tracking something in particular, you can turn to that central team for some advice and some help to optimize your monitoring. And so from there, that's something that I'm seeing happen now. I'm seeing SREs emerge. I've talked to a number of people here who call themselves SREs. They're often on different teams, so I think the SRE function is really still evolving and is really different depending on the organization. And from there, I see folks sometime in the future moving into some future state, which I frankly haven't really defined super well in my mind, but I think it probably involves a lot of automation as things continue to get more complex and dynamic in your application environment. You might begin to use your monitoring tools primarily to feed automations, right? To fix problems as they're occurring. And I have the sense that people like you all in the room are going to spend a lot less time in those monitoring tools, and again, those tools are really just going to feed automations. I think we're going to need people who have more automation expertise. I think that's going to become a skill that's going to be really important down the road. And I just wanted to mention that I've seen this change, this kind of evolution in terms of the way ops is approached happens along with the adoption of increasingly abstracted tools. And so I kind of see that evolution happen as people move along this so-called spectrum of abstraction. This is something one of my colleagues developed that I think is kind of interesting. But this is happening for a reason, right? This experimentation with the way that people are organizing ops and development. It's required as you use more and more abstract technologies, right? As you're moving from physical infrastructure and bare metal to VMs and containers and microservices and maybe even into serverless architectures. So I'm seeing this evolution happen sort of along the same spectrum as people are adopting these more and more abstract technologies. And I want to talk specifically for just a second about microservices and the relationship between the adoption of microservices and some of the challenges that people are facing. So, I'm hearing more and more, I'm sure you guys are increasingly breaking up your monolithic applications into microservices or starting with microservices to begin with. But this is really complicated, and I just wanted to flash this quote because I thought it was really interesting. So when we do our surveys, we also do a certain number of live interviews with people, and I really like this. This person said, there's not a lot of people with microservices skills. It's really about running an approach to develop ops in the context of large applications. When you get to hundreds and thousands of services, how do you run those? How do you scale that? There's not a lot of people that can do that. And so I just wanted to sort of harken back to some, what I was talking about earlier in my talk in terms of complexity and sort of needing skills and actually someone or some team who's designated as responsible for offering this overall view of things like microservices. I think that this person is suffering from some of those things that I was talking about earlier. So I'm just going to talk for a few more minutes about some recommendations. These are some big picture recommendations, and then I'll talk a little bit about more tactical recommendations. But if you're very early in the process of kind of shifting to cloud native technologies, if you're just very, very early in that process, I would encourage you to try to bake in monitoring into your process of evolving into these more leading edge technologies. Because some of the problems that I see happen because ops and monitoring is an afterthought, right? So it happens because there's not a clear delineation between what the DevOps team is supposed to be doing and what the central ops or observability team is supposed to be doing. And that's where things fall through the cracks. So it sounds really simple, but if you can be thoughtful, put in a plan as you're evolving, that's going to really help you. I say plot division of duty and authority because one of the really interesting things that I talk to people about all the time is when they're trying to whittle down the number of monitoring tools that are being used. That is a really difficult process, both from a cultural perspective, but also because very often there's no one who has the authority to tell people you have to do this, you can't do that. And that's partly, baked in on purpose into this ideal DevOps culture, right, where you're supposed to be able to adopt what you want. But if that's causing you problems, it would be good if someone has the authority to put everyone on the same page, make some decisions here. And I actually have some really interesting examples of trouble that people have had with that. There was someone I was speaking with a couple months ago at a pretty big enterprise, and she worked for a central ops team. The performance of the application, the user experience was her job, right? If it was bad, it was her butt on the line. But she didn't have the authority to tell the DevOps teams what to do, what tools to use. And what she ended up doing was requiring those teams, if they didn't choose the tool that she liked, the monitoring tool she wanted, they had to run her tool concurrently with their own. So people were running multiple monitoring tools that were doing the same thing on their workloads because they sort of couldn't work this out, right? They couldn't agree on a same tool. That sounds like a pretty bad approach to me. I actually talked to a guy here yesterday over lunch who had, I thought, a really interesting approach. So he worked for a central team, like an ops or an observability team. He had chosen Sumo actually as a central tool, the logging tool. He was running it. He was their resident expert, like I was talking about before. And then the DevOps teams used Sumo and could rely on him as an expert. But a number of these DevOps teams had their own elk stack. They were running their own elk stacks for logging, and they didn't want to give it up. He wanted to centralize everything, didn't have the authority to tell them to give it up. So what he did was he set an end-of-life date after which he would no longer help out when people filed trouble tickets for their elk stacks. So he sort of an underhanded way of basically forcing people off elk and onto Sumo. There's other really thoughtful ways, I think, that you can shift people onto a centralized tool, right? So I've heard from organizations that will sort of find a poster child, right? Like maybe somebody in a group, they're interested in using your tool of choice. You get their team to start using it. You start to demonstrate the benefits, and you get that team to, again, be like a poster child, right? Show other teams the benefits of using this particular tool. And I'd say one benefit of moving to this sort of centralized approach in terms of managing your monitoring tools is that it takes some workload off of your individual teams, right? So I also talked to a lot of people. I was just talking to somebody before I got up here who said, about 30% of his job is running the monitoring tools for his team. He was on a team that's shifting their workloads to Kubernetes. But every other team in his organization also has someone who has like 30% of their job is dedicated to monitoring. It's not real efficient, right? Like, everybody has some piece, and they're not, 30% of your job is maybe not enough, right, to get the most out of the tool. So I also hear people tell me that they don't feel like they're getting really all the benefits from their monitoring tools. So in a lot of ways, it's more efficient to try to sort of centralize that expertise in a team that does it all day, every day. And then so more from like a tactical, perspective. I like the idea of, I've heard some organizations, they set so if they have a central team that's kind of trying to ensure that monitoring is done correctly, they will set data collection policies. And by that, I mean, they'll say, your app, you have to give me at least this level of visibility. You have to collect maybe this set of metrics, and you have to send them centrally. so that they can contribute to this overall view of of a microservices-based application. So you can set those policies and think about how to enforce them. So I've also heard from organizations that have data collection policies. They've built that into their CI/CD pipeline. So if you're trying to push code to prod and you haven't instrumented it, or you haven't set it so that you're collecting this bare minimum of operations data, you're not going to be, it's a gate, you're not going to be able to push to prod. So that's one idea. Determine tool autonomy, so that by that I just mean, who has the authority to make decisions around tooling, whether they're popular or not. Develop a data centralization system. So this could be, you don't necessarily have to dictate that everybody use specific monitoring tools, but you'll get a lot of benefits by bringing all of your ops data centralized, or most of it. So, you might be able to establish one tool as that central spot where everyone is instructed to send their or a set of their IT operations data for central analytics and correlation. Incident reviews, I think you guys all know this, but I think this is actually also something that can point to holes that might have opened up in terms of who's doing what between a DevOps and a centralized team. So if you're regularly doing post-incident reviews, you're going to be able to find those gaps and close them. And then finally, everyone I talk to talks about a skills gap. I mean, everybody's learning, right? Kubernetes is so new. If you're deploying Kubernetes, you're probably not just going to go out and hire an expert. You've got to learn it. So anything you can do to encourage people on your team, or the higher ups to enable people to learn. And there's obviously a variety of ways to do that. It could be internally, it could be through peers. So I think that's a really important thing. And to make sure to keep an eye on the future skill set that you're going to need around things like automation. And so that's it. My parting thought is a couple of resources. One is a report that I just did, which is for subscribers only, sorry. Or some of you maybe have seen this Google report that they just put out, their State of DevOps report. And they actually had some interesting things in there sort of around organizational stuff and what kind of organizational models tend to be more successful. And I think you can download that, or at least a part of it, online, so it might be worth looking at. And that's it. I think we're ready for questions, if there are any, or comments. Happy to hear if anyone has any stories to tell, good or bad.
Thanks, Nancy. Any questions at this point? Sorry.
Hi, thanks. That was a really great talk. I was just going to ask, I'm from what sounds to be a much smaller development team than ones that you've been describing largely in here. You were talking about multiple apps and talking to other teams. Do you have any advice for somebody that's maybe got multiple apps on one big team of multiple apps?
Are you struggling with something in particular?
Having the time to look at everything.
Yeah.
When things go down, we've got good things to figure out what went wrong, but maybe having the time to preempt it and using these tools to figure out what's going to go wrong before it goes wrong.
Do you have sort of people who are kind of like resident expert at the tools that you use? You do?
Yeah.
Yeah. Then I guess it's just, do you do post-incident reviews?
Yeah, for big ones, absolutely.
Yeah, because I would think that would point out, some of those gaps, but it sounds like, I don't know, maybe is your alerting, how do you feel about your alerting?
That's why I'm here today, right?
Yeah. I mean, maybe you should think about the way your alerts are architected in a way that would indicate problems that are occurring sooner, so you can fix them earlier.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said learning, not alerting.
Oh, yeah.
I was like,
sorry.
learning, that's why I'm here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, alerts, yeah, well, plenty of alerts, absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe it's an alert tuning thing, right? Because if you're, yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, though.
Sounds good. We have time for one more question, I guess. I don't think there are any more questions, so thanks a lot, Nancy, for your...
Thanks. Sorry. Thanks.